Welcome to my September reading wrap up. This month I read 7 books, so I'm just gonna get into it. So, the first thing that I read this month was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and this book is about a girl, and she gets a letter from her cousin who lives far away, and her cousin sounds unwell. So her father's like, "You need to go out and check on your cousin and make sure she's okay." So the girl goes out, and the setting is this Gothic mansion with creepy people in it. It's very, very atmospheric. I really like this book for several reasons. First, the characters were awesome. Like, reading from Noemi's perspective was so entertaining. The author gave her some characteristics that normally would be unlikable for me, but the way that Noemi handled them just made her unique, and I found her very endearing and entertaining. I also appreciate how all of the characters just fit well with the setting and the location, and I think that the way that they all interacted added so much to the atmosphere. This book was exciting and dark and mysterious, and it kept me guessing all the way up until right toward the end. I personally have never read this sort of trope before, and I have heard from some other people on BookTube that it is somewhat popular, but I just have never seen it before. So for me, this was a very unique read, and I appreciated that it was different from my normal thriller or my normal spooky haunted book, you know? The only thing that I kind of disliked about this book was the ending, and it's not necessarily that I disliked it. I just think that it was a little bit too good to be true, maybe, and I wonder if there could potentially be a sequel where it didn't actually end up as good as it seemed to. But honestly, I was happy with it. I think it was the better option of some of the options that I had in my mind. So I'll take it. I'm happy with it. And overall, I gave this book 5 stars. The next book that I read this month was Heavenbreaker by Sara. So this book is about revenge, and we've got a female character, and she is experiencing so much rage. She has been through it her whole life, and she is finally trying to seek retribution for everything that has happened to her. This book is definitely unique. It's got a sci-fi element, and it has space jousting, which is interesting. It honestly was a very good premise. I was really liking it in the beginning, but then it just kind of went downhill. I did really enjoy the setting of this book. It was sci-fi and very dystopian. I really did enjoy the writing style of this book. I think that it was captivating. It kept me engaged. I think that it could have been very successful if not for other factors. I do think that this story had good elements and good plot points, but then it just didn't work with them. To give you an idea of what I mean, if books could have the uncanny valley vibe, then this book would have that. Because I look at it and I can see that it has all of the elements and makings of a good book, but something about it is just wrong. At times, I would be paying attention and I'd be into it, and then all of a sudden, you would just be experiencing a completely different moment and scene, and I would kind of have to backtrack and be like, "Whoa, like, what did I miss?" But then I didn't really miss anything, the transition just wasn't very great. This book was one where I got to the end, I only had about an hour or two left, and I just had absolutely no desire to complete this book. None of the characters experienced any growth. I really don't like to read a story where your character is the same the entire time. They don't learn any lessons, they don't adapt any of their behaviors. It's just frustrating, especially when your main character is as insufferable as this main character. She's so immature and childish. The number of temper tantrums in this book is astounding, and the number of times where she's just so mean to someone who is being genuinely kind to her, I can't stand it. And I was like, okay, this is good. This is creating a great opportunity for her to develop and grow. But no, you don't see any of that in this book, and it was so tiresome. An old man made her a birthday cake, and she smashed it. She didn't even eat it. That's so mean. And then later, the old man was trying to help her, and she kicked him. Get out of here. Another thing that I really didn't like about this is that it was described as a romance, and that's not really the book's fault, but that is the advertising team's fault, and it was so inaccurate. This book is not a romance. There's like maybe what you would call a romance, but it's barely in the book. It's barely a thing. Nothing happens, and there are no grounds for the There's no reason. It just exists and it's out of nowhere, and I don't care about it at all. Another thing that I think failed for this book was the number of morally gray characters. And when I say that, I mean every single character was morally gray. And I think that morally gray characters are great. They can add a lot to a story, and I really appreciate the perspective that they provide. But when every single character is morally gray and every single character does not experience any growth, it just gets old and repetitive, and it was a fail. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about my dislike for this book, and I gave it 2 stars. Okay, let's move on. So, the third book that I read this month was Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater, and this book was so good. In the Goodreads description for this book, it says that it is Bridgerton meets Howl's Moving Castle, and I think that is very fitting. This book is a classic Regency era fairy tale. It is so sweet. I loved so much about it. It was very memorable. It's definitely something that is going to stick with me. Sometimes I read a book and then I forget the characters' names the next day, but not this one. It will stay in my mind for a long time. The dialogue in this book was really well written, and the banter, and just selling the romance, like, it was done so well. There was one instance where I think their hands touched and they weren't wearing gloves or something, and I was, like, giggling and excited about that, so. Another thing I really enjoyed about this book was the main character's perspective, because I don't think it's a spoiler to say that she was missing half of a soul, given that that is the title. But anyway, with that, she had a very unique personality. She didn't really behave like a normal human in every scenario, and it was kind of quirky and funny to watch how she interacted with the world around her and the people around her. Something that I liked about this book that was very refreshing after Heavenbreaker is that the characters experienced growth. It was so sweet. They like came to terms with themselves and they learned to care about things outside of themselves and see the darker parts of the world and talk about the darker parts of the world. And it was so good. I loved it. As for dislikes, none. I adore this book and I will recommend it until the day that I die, and I gave it 5 stars. After that, I read Odd Thomas by Dean Koontz. It was my second time through, and the first time I read it, it was 5 stars. This time, it was also 5 stars. So it's about a guy named Odd Thomas, and he sees dead people, and sometimes he helps them with their unfinished business. Other times, he senses things about the paranormal world, and he can kind of use those to predict when tragic events are going to occur or anticipate those things. So this book is about Odd, and he is trying to figure out what is about to go down because it looks like it's going to be really, really bad. And this book is a thriller. It is very exciting. It's slightly spooky, so well written. One of the things that I really love about this book is how real the characters feel. They're written with so much depth. They all have little quirks and details that are unnecessary, but they add so much. Another thing that I really like about this book is the writing style. Similar to the way that Dean Koontz adds little things that aren't really necessary to his characters that improve them, he does that with the whole setting and the whole story. There are just tidbits here and there that make it feel really unique, really engaging. So overall, the story is gripping and well designed and addictive. This would also be a great one for fall if you're interested. The next book that I read was The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I went in completely blind, so had no idea what was gonna happen, what was really going on, except for what I got from the title and the book cover. What I got from that was Southern Book Club and vampires, and then cute little cover art. So I thought, this is gonna be a goofy story about a bunch of housewives murdering some, like, monster. Maybe it's not even a monster. What I got was a very dark story that was kind of gory and gruesome at times, but it was well told. Let's talk about it. This book is about a woman, and she has 2 kids and a husband, and they live in the deep south in, like, the 90s? I don't know exactly when. So much happens in this book, and it's hard to describe in a way. So our main character, Patricia, she meets this person who is a bit suspicious, and things just kind of go down from there. And I can't really say much else without spoiling it, but let's talk about what I like. As I said, this book was very well written. Most of the characters were very endearing, except for the stupid husbands. I hold so much hatred in my heart for them. The kids were also brats. Another thing that I really liked about this book is the angle that they kind of took with the vampire. Some of the words that they used to describe the vampire had entomological roots. They were like insectoid. And I found that really intriguing. I appreciated a vampire story that wasn't necessarily your classic, like, Edward Cullen. I liked that it was different, and I also liked the hints at parasitism being a thing that was potentially happening there. I just enjoyed that because I like bugs, so I geeked out a little bit. Another thing that I really liked about this book is that instead of the characters being like, "What's going on? Let's figure it out," our character, she knew what was up for a lot of the book, and she didn't have all the details. She did acquire some of them as the story went on, but she really did know a decent amount. And the real struggle in this story was getting people to believe her and help her, and it just was not happening, which was really frustrating, but it was an interesting route for the story to take. One thing I didn't really like about this book is that the first 3 quarters were kind of the same vibe, and then the last quarter of the book just got really dark out of nowhere, which that's fine. I feel like the vibe was not established and maintained. It just kind of came out of nowhere. I also didn't really enjoy the way that the plot happened. It was really good for the first 3 quarters of the book, and then I feel like in the end, things were just happening, and it didn't feel like they had been planned to happen that way. It just felt like, I've got to finish this book, something has to happen, and then it was rushed. It felt rushed. There were also a couple points where I was reading and something would happen, and it just really didn't make sense. At one point in the story, a character showed up at a place, and I do not know where she got the time and date to be there. I don't know how she knew where and when to go, and it just felt cheesy in a way. It wouldn't have actually happened. Overall, I do think that this was a good book, and I did enjoy it. It really came apart for me there in the end, so I only feel comfortable giving it like a 3.5 maybe. It's almost 4 stars, but it's just not quite there for me. Next, I read Yellowface by RF Kuang. This book is about a woman who acquires a manuscript that is not her own, and she publishes it, and you're just kind of seeing what happens with that. I liked things about this book. I think the writing style was really engaging. The character was very complex. I liked that she wasn't completely open with you. You kind of heard the story from the point of view that she wanted you to hear it from. As you get further into the end, you'll understand why it was written that way, but it was still just a fun perspective to read from. I think that this book did a morally gray character very well, unlike Heavenbreaker. Screw Heavenbreaker. Some things that I disliked about Yellowface are the predictability, for one. I feel like I knew what was going to happen the entire time, and I think that that was partially intentional. The author wanted you to anticipate and dread, and I did, in fact, anticipate and dread. So I suppose it was successful. I just don't think it was the optimal reading experience for my own preferences. In general, I like to be kept guessing a little bit more than I was with this book. Another thing that I disliked about this book is the villain monologue in the end. I feel like that came out of nowhere and it just read really cheesy. It felt very cliche. Overall, I did enjoy this story, and I think that it is a good story. It's not quite my style, and that's not the fault of the author, but nonetheless, it was a 3-star read for me. If I met someone who seemed like they would enjoy this type of work, I would totally recommend it for them. It's just not something that I would ever want to return to, and I don't think that it was that unique or notable. The last book that I read this month was Cold Fire by Dean Koontz. Let's talk about it. The plot in this book is quite literally insane. It is all over the place. In the beginning, I was like, oh, this has potential. This could be really good and exciting. And then it just went off the deep end. I hate to be this blunt, but I think that it was stupid. So this book is about a man named Jim, and he is rescuing people under really weird circumstances. And this reporter named Holly is like, that's weird. I noticed that. I'm going to investigate. And then it goes actually insane. If you read the first half of this book and then sat down and wrote down your prediction of what was going to happen, you would be so off. There's no way that you could guess what would happen in this book. So I guess that is well done in a way, but it's just so dumb. What did I like about this book? I liked the first half. I think that the writing was really well done. The characters were fun to read. They felt real. You know, it's Dean Koontz. He does a good job with that. I really liked the premise of this book. I think that it could have been a really interesting story, and I think that it could have been a really great one for me. It just didn't go the way that allowed that to happen. Now let's talk about what I disliked. Number 1, insta love. Yes, this book has it. I hate it. There's no excuse for it. It was self-aware, but that doesn't matter. It's just dumb. I don't like it. This book did the thing that older books tend to do, where it's like, in his dream, blah, blah, blah. And you keep hearing about the dreams and it gets really tiresome. Something that I absolutely despise with the entirety of my heart is the way that Holly started treating him like she was his mother in the last part of the book. She'd be like, "It's okay, baby. It's okay, honey. Honey, you have to do that." Ew. Ew. Don't talk to your boyfriend like that. That's gross. Please, I'm begging. I also really don't understand how Holly came to her realization at the end. Like, some things happened, and yes, it was hinted at, but drawing the line between the hint and the conclusion that she made, it just wouldn't happen. It was so unrealistic, and also, it was so stupid, and the fact that it was true was just gross. I just didn't like it. Another thing that I want to touch on is that a certain disorder ends up being very important for the plot, and they just kind of deal with it, and it's like, oh, we're just gonna do these things, and that's gonna cure the disorder. No, it doesn't happen that way. You gotta like do therapy and like self-reflection and stuff. You don't just recover some things and then, oop, I don't have it anymore. No. So yeah, I understand why this book was in Goodwill, and I gave it 2 stars, and that's honestly being very generous. The only reason that it has 2 stars instead of 1 is because I did enjoy the first part, and I'm also slightly biased towards favoring Dean Koontz. I love that author. With that, that is everything that I read in September, so thank you for being here, and if you feel so inclined, you could comment a nice fall reading recommendation for me, particularly spooky books, because I'm looking to read some for a video, potentially.